They said the dog was too old, too slow, too late to matter. They said the man was finished too. A former Navy SEAL with no orders left to follow, no battlefield waiting for him. But on a frozen mountain in Colorado, when a storm erased every trail and hope was running out of time, an old dog stopped, and because he did, a man lived. Strangers lived. That night, no miracle came from the sky. No voice spoke from the clouds. The miracle came quietly, through loyalty, through choice. Through a servant God was not done with yet. This is the story of a warrior who did not retire, and a lesson the world forgot how to see. Snow drifted down over the mountain road like something undecided, neither storm nor silence, just enough to blur the edges of the world. Caleb Morrison drove slowly, hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead as Silver Ridge emerged from the haze. The town sat tucked into the western slope of Colorado's mountains, modest and unpretentious, built for people who preferred distance over convenience. Roofs sagged under fresh snow, storefront lights glowed dimly through frosted windows, and the air carried the sharp, clean bite of winter that made every breath feel deliberate. Caleb did not come here looking for anything specific. That alone unsettled him. At 41, he had lived most of his life moving toward objectives, clear, measurable, and final. Now, retired from the Navy SEALs, he found himself drawn to places without direction, as if the absence of expectation might finally quiet the part of him that still listened for orders. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his frame shaped by years of training that never truly left the body. His dark hair was cropped short and flecked with gray, his face weathered not by age, but by repetition, long deployments, short sleep, and the kind of focus that carved lines into the skin. He wore an olive jacket thick enough to block the cold, faded jeans, and boots scuffed from years of use. There was nothing about him that invited attention, and that suited him just fine. The K-9 facility stood just beyond town limits, half hidden by pine trees heavy with snow. It had once been military-run, though the years had softened its authority. The concrete walls bore stains from decades of weather, and the metal gate creaked faintly when Caleb pushed it open. A sign near the entrance had faded almost to illegibility, its emblem worn smooth by time. This was not a place that had failed. It was a place that had simply been left behind. Inside, warmth greeted him, along with the faint smell of disinfectant and animal fur. The air carried echoes, barks layered with whines, some sharp with youth, others low and tired. Behind the front desk stood a woman reviewing paperwork with practiced efficiency. Her name tag read, Sarah Whitaker. Sarah appeared to be in her late 30s, average in height, with a lean build shaped by long hours on her feet rather than any deliberate effort. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, functional and plain, with a few loose strands brushing her cheek. Her face was calm, observant, marked by the subtle patience of someone who had learned that trust, human or animal, was not something to rush. She wore a fleece jacket over her uniform, sleeves rolled slightly, revealing forearms faintly scratched from years of working hands-on with dogs who didn't always arrive gentle. She looked up as Caleb approached, her expression neutral but attentive. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Caleb replied. His voice was low, steady, unused to small talk. "I was told you had retired K-9s here." Sarah nodded. "We do, not as many as we used to, but a few." "I'm not looking for a specific dog," Caleb added, sensing the question before she asked it. "Just the ones no one asks about anymore." That earned him a pause. Sarah studied him, not suspiciously, but carefully, as if weighing whether the words were genuine or rehearsed. Then she reached beneath the desk and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a printed list. "These are the retired dogs currently housed here," she said, sliding the papers toward him. "Most visitors don't ask to see this. They usually want the younger ones. Easier transitions." Caleb took the list. It held names, breeds, ages, service notes, and dates. He didn't linger on the names. What caught his attention were the numbers, the timelines, how long each dog had been waiting. One entry stood apart. Briggs, German Shepherd, age 10, retired 18 months. Caleb looked up. He's been here longer than the others. Sarah followed his gaze and nodded. Yes. Why? She hesitated, her fingers resting lightly on the desk. Because people want dogs they can grow old with, she said quietly. Not ones who are already there. Caleb tapped the paper once thoughtfully. May I meet him? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the list, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into the folder. Of course, she said at last, but I want to be honest. Briggs doesn't make a good first impression. I'm not here for impressions, Caleb replied. They walked down a long hallway lined with kennels. The noise rose and fell around them, dogs pressing forward, tails wagging, bodies tense with hope. Sarah adjusted her pace instinctively, slowing near anxious dogs, moving briskly past others. She knew these animals the way some people knew family, each behavior a familiar language. Briggs's kennel sat at the far end. He did not bark. He sat quietly, his large frame relaxed but alert, watching them approach. Briggs was a German Shepherd with a thick coat of black and sable fur, dulled slightly by age, but still dense and well kept. Silver traced his muzzle and the edges of his eyes, giving him a solemn, dignified appearance. One ear stood fully upright, the other bore a small notch near the tip, a remnant of some old injury long healed. His posture was calm, deliberate, the stillness of a dog who had learned that energy was something to conserve. He's 10, Sarah said softly. His joints are slower, his hearing's not what it used to be. But his mind... She trailed off. Caleb stopped a few feet from the gate. He didn't speak. He didn't move closer. He simply stood and waited. Briggs rose to his feet, slow but steady. He stepped forward until he was close to the gate, eyes level with Caleb's. There was no excitement in his gaze. No fear, just awareness, assessment. Caleb felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not emotion exactly, but recognition. He had seen this look before in mirrors and in men who had outlasted their usefulness in systems that measured worth by speed and strength. He doesn't react much to strangers, Sarah said. Some people take that personally. I don't, Caleb replied. Briggs tilted his head slightly, then sat again, as if satisfied. Snowlight filtered through the narrow window, casting soft shadows across his scarred coat. Caleb noticed the faint marks beneath the fur, evidence of a life that had demanded more than obedience. This one's not finished, Caleb said quietly. Sarah glanced at him. Most people don't see it that way. That's because they're looking at the label, he answered, not what's underneath. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks as quickly as they were made. Inside the kennel, Briggs held Caleb's gaze, unblinking and calm. The label said the dog was too old. Caleb knew better. Some value doesn't disappear with time. It waits for someone willing to recognize it. Caleb Morrison woke before the sun, as he always did, not because he wanted to, but because his body had learned to distrust quiet mornings. The cabin he rented sat at the edge of Silver Ridge, a modest structure tucked among tall pines that groaned softly under the weight of new snow. Overnight, the storm had deepened. Snow pressed against the windows in thick layers, muting the world until even the wind seemed to speak in whispers. The town lay still, its narrow roads erased into white corridors that led nowhere in particular. The cabin was sparsely furnished, not out of taste, but habit. A wooden table scarred by years of use, a couch that smelled faintly of pine cleaner, a narrow bed pressed against the far wall. Caleb had arranged the space with efficiency, not comfort. He lived here the way he had learned to live everywhere else, prepared to leave at a moment's notice, even though he had nowhere to go. At 41, Caleb carried the quiet weight of a man who had been useful once and was no longer certain how to be. His days in uniform had given him structure, identity, and an unquestioned sense of purpose. Without it, time stretched oddly. Hours slipped past without markers. Meals were eaten because the body demanded them, not because hunger announced itself with enthusiasm. The mirror above the sink reflected a man who still looked capable, strong even, but whose eyes searched for something beyond the walls. He brewed coffee the way he had overseas, strong and bitter, letting the steam fog the small kitchen window. The smell grounded him, but only briefly. As he sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, he felt the familiar unease creep in, the sense that he was waiting for instructions that would never come. No radio, no briefing, no voice telling him where to be and why it mattered. By mid-morning, Caleb pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The cold bit sharply, clean and honest. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked into town, passing shuttered storefronts and quiet houses with smoke curling from chimneys. Silver Ridge revealed itself slowly to newcomers, but Caleb had already learned its rhythm. It was a place built on routines, on people who showed up every day whether they were seen or not. At the corner cafe, a bell chimed softly as he entered. The warmth inside was immediate, thick with the smell of coffee and baked bread. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 50s with a sturdy build and silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Her name was Margaret Hale, though everyone called her Maggie. She wore a wool sweater dusted with flour and moved with the confidence of someone who had fed this town for decades. Maggie had lost her husband years ago in a logging accident, an event that had hardened her edges but softened her patience. She greeted everyone with the same steady kindness, understanding that people came here carrying things they did not wish to set down. "Morning," she said as Caleb approached, already reaching for a mug. "Snow's not letting up." "Doesn't look like it," Caleb replied. She slid the coffee toward him without asking how he took it. "You settling in all right?" Caleb nodded, though the gesture felt incomplete. Getting used to the quiet. Maggie studied him for a moment, her gaze gentle but perceptive. "Quiet can be louder than noise," she said, then turned to help another customer. She did not press him. People in Silver Ridge understood when to leave space. Caleb took a seat by the window, watching the snow fall in heavy sheets. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to places far removed from mountains and cafes. Heat instead of cold. Sand instead of snow. The memory of being needed sharpened unexpectedly, a dull ache behind his ribs. He finished his coffee quickly and left before the quiet grew unbearable. The rest of the day passed without incident, yet every hour felt heavier than the last. Caleb returned to the cabin, cleaned gear that no longer served a purpose, and paced the narrow rooms as if expecting something to change simply by moving. In the afternoon, he found himself driving without a destination, the truck's tires carving familiar paths through the snow until the K9 facility appeared again between the trees. He did not plan to stop. He did anyway. Inside, the facility hummed with low energy. Sarah Whitaker was near the kennels, crouched beside a young Labrador who leaned eagerly into her touch. She looked up when she heard Caleb approach. Sarah was dressed as she had been before, practical and understated, her posture relaxed but attentive. Years earlier, she had left a fast-paced city job after burnout and a failed marriage, choosing instead to work somewhere quieter, with animals who asked less and offered honesty in return. That choice had shaped her into someone who valued patience above all else. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," she said. "I wasn't sure I'd be back," Caleb replied truthfully. She smiled faintly. "That's usually how it starts." They walked together down the row of kennels. Dogs stirred as they passed, some barking softly, others watching with hopeful eyes. When they reached the far end, Briggs lifted his head. He remained seated, his movements measured, his attention immediate. In the daylight, his age was more apparent, the silver around his muzzle catching the light, but so was his composure. He carried himself like a dog who had learned restraint, not from fear, but from experience. Caleb stopped outside the kennel, resting his hand against the cold metal. He did not speak. He did not reach for the latch. He simply stood there, breathing in rhythm with the space. "You don't have to decide anything today," Sarah said quietly. "I know," Caleb answered. Briggs rose and stepped closer, his eyes steady. There was no excitement, no uncertainty, just presence. Something shifted then, subtle but undeniable. Not hope exactly, not relief, more like recognition settling into place. Caleb felt it in the way his shoulders loosened, in the way the silence stopped pressing against him. Outside, the snow continued its slow descent, covering old tracks, smoothing the rough edges of the town. Inside the facility, a man without orders and a dog without a role stood facing each other, neither asking for anything, neither turning away. For the first time since leaving the teams, Caleb did not feel entirely useless. The feeling did not come with clarity or direction. It came quietly, like the snow, promising nothing beyond the present moment. And for now, that was enough. Morning arrived without ceremony in Silver Ridge, the sky a pale sheet of gray stretched low over the mountains. Snow no longer fell, but the cold lingered, settled deep into the ground as if it intended to stay. Caleb Morrison drove toward the K-9 facility just after sunrise, the road familiar now, the turns anticipated before they appeared. He told himself he was only there to observe, to confirm what he had felt the day before. He did not yet allow the word decision to take shape. Inside the facility, the day had already begun. Kennel doors opened and closed in steady rhythm. The sounds were purposeful, not chaotic. Sarah Whitaker moved through the space with practiced ease, her presence calming the dogs long before she reached them. In daylight, the years of work showed more clearly on her face, not as weariness, but as depth. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind earned rather than imposed. Loss had shaped her patience years earlier, when a K-9 under her care had been retired abruptly after an injury she believed could have been rehabilitated. Since then, she trusted her judgment more than policy, though she rarely said so aloud. "You're early," she said when she saw Caleb at the entrance. "I didn't sleep much," he replied. She nodded, as if that explained everything. Most people don't at first. They walked together toward the exercise yard behind the building. The snow there had been cleared into rough paths, bordered by tall fencing and pines that creaked softly in the wind. Sarah signaled to a handler nearby, a young man named Lucas Reed, mid-20s, lean and earnest, still carrying the restless energy of someone new to responsibility. Lucas opened the gate and stepped aside. Briggs entered the yard without hesitation. In motion, the old German shepherd revealed truths the kennel could not. His gait was slower, yes, but controlled. Every step was deliberate, economical. He scanned the perimeter instinctively, nose testing the air, ears adjusting to distant sounds. When Sarah dropped a small training object into the snow without warning, Briggs pivoted instantly, body aligning before thought could catch up. He located it in seconds, returning with quiet precision, placing it gently at her feet. Caleb watched, arms crossed, eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in focus. He recognized the rhythm immediately, the way training settled into muscle memory, so deep it became instinct. Briggs did not move like a dog performing a trick. He moved like someone on duty. "His joints slow him down," Sarah said, reading Caleb's silence. But his awareness never left. Caleb nodded. "Neither does responsibility." She glanced at him then, just briefly, noting the way his posture mirrored the dog's alert stillness. "You see it?" she said. "I know it," Caleb answered. They continued with simple exercises. Briggs responded to hand signals without delay, adjusting to terrain, compensating where strength had faded with judgment refined by years. When a loud noise echoed from the far side of the yard, Briggs shifted position subtly, placing himself between the sound and Caleb without command. The movement was unconscious, protective. "That wasn't taught," Sarah said softly. Caleb felt the recognition settle deeper now, not emotional, but exact. He had seen men discarded for less, sidelined because experience was mistaken for limitation. The system valued speed, novelty, youth. It rarely valued endurance. Later, back inside, Sarah poured coffee into chipped mugs and leaned against the counter. "I should tell you the risks," she said. "Medical costs? Limited working years? Most adopters don't want that responsibility." "I'm not most adopters," Caleb replied. She studied him again, longer this time. "Why him?" Caleb looked through the window toward the kennel where Briggs now rested, alert even in stillness. "Because he's not finished," he said, "and neither am I." The words surprised him with their certainty. Sarah set the mug down carefully. "I won't stop you," she said. "But I need you to understand something. Briggs doesn't need saving. He needs someone who won't try to turn him into something else." Caleb met her gaze. "I wouldn't know how." The paperwork came later, forms spread across the desk, signatures required where policy demanded them. Miles Carter, the facility manager, joined them midway through. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with thinning hair and a permanent crease between his brows from years spent balancing budgets and regulations. Miles respected procedure above all else, not from cruelty, but from caution. He had seen good intentions end badly too many times. "This dog has limits," Miles said plainly, tapping the file. "He's past operational age." "I'm not recruiting him," Caleb replied evenly. Miles paused, then sighed. "Just know what you're taking on." Caleb nodded. He had known weight before. When the gate finally opened and Briggs stepped forward, the moment carried no triumph, no ceremony, just a quiet transfer of responsibility. Briggs paused once, glancing back at Sarah. She crouched, resting her hand briefly against his neck, her touch firm and affectionate. "You did good," she said. Briggs turned and followed Caleb without looking back. Outside, the cold air cut sharp and clean. Snow reflected the pale sky, and the mountains stood unmoved by small human decisions. Caleb walked toward his truck, Briggs at his side, matching pace without instruction. Two figures moving together, neither leading, neither lagging. As they drove away from the facility, Caleb felt the shape of something forming, not a plan, but a recognition long overdue. He was not reclaiming a role. He was accepting one. Two warriors, labeled expendable, had found each other not in glory, but in understanding. And for the first time in years, Caleb did not feel left behind. He felt chosen. The mountains did not change for newcomers. They waited, unmoved, patient in a way that felt almost deliberate. In the days after Briggs came home, winter tightened its grip around Silver Ridge, drawing sharp lines between what was safe and what was not. Snow fell in uneven cycles, sometimes light and drifting, sometimes dense and punishing, reshaping trails overnight. Caleb Morrison noticed these shifts the way he once noticed changes in wind or silence, not consciously at first, but with a sense that something was being rewritten while no one was watching. The cabin adjusted to a second presence without ceremony. Briggs chose a spot near the door where drafts crept along the floor, and the scent of the outside lingered. He did not wander. He did not test boundaries. He lay down as if he had been there all along. Up close, the signs of age were clearer. The silvered muzzle, the stiffness that eased only after a few minutes of movement. Yet his eyes remained sharp, tracking every sound, every shift in light through the windows. He was 10 years old, built solid and heavy-boned, his coat thick enough to turn away the cold, his posture relaxed but never careless. Caleb did not issue commands. He did not clip a whistle to his jacket or raise his voice. Instead, he watched. He moved slowly through the snow, testing footing, letting Briggs choose the pace. When Caleb stopped, Briggs stopped. When Caleb turned, Briggs adjusted without instruction. There was no hierarchy in it, no visible structure, only a quiet alignment that felt less like training and more like remembering. They began at dawn each morning when the snow was still untouched and the air carried a brittle stillness. Caleb used hand signals he had once relied on in situations where sound meant exposure. Briggs responded instantly, reading intention rather than instruction. A raised palm, a slight shift of weight, a pause held just long enough to mean stay. Briggs did not hesitate. He did not seek approval. He executed, then waited, steady and unassuming. Caleb felt the change in himself first. His breathing evened. His movements grew economical again. The restless energy that had followed him since leaving the teams began to settle into something quieter, more precise. He no longer felt the absence of orders as a loss. Instead, he felt the return of agency. They trained beyond the cabin, moving into the lower forest where snow collected unevenly over rock and root. The terrain there was deceptive, paths narrowing suddenly, slopes steepening without warning. Caleb paid attention to how Briggs navigated these spaces. The dog adjusted his stride instinctively, avoiding unstable patches, choosing routes that balanced risk and efficiency. When a section of ground shifted under Caleb's weight, Briggs stopped short, blocking forward movement without contact, his body angled protectively, eyes fixed ahead. It was not obedience. It was judgment. As the days passed, signs of instability in the mountains grew harder to ignore. Snowpack thickened along exposed ridges. Temperatures rose briefly, then dropped sharply, creating layers that did not bond. Caleb noticed fractures forming along slopes that had been stable for years. He had learned to read environments under stress, and this one was speaking clearly. Something was building. Back at the K-9 facility, Sarah Whitaker watched the weather reports with increasing concern. She stood by the window of her small office, arms folded, her posture tight in a way that betrayed worry she rarely allowed herself to show. Sarah was not prone to anxiety. Years of working with animals who reacted to tension had taught her restraint. But she had grown up in these mountains. She knew how quickly conditions could turn from manageable to lethal. She saw Caleb and Briggs pass the perimeter fence one afternoon, moving together through the snow. The absence of command struck her immediately. No leash tension, no verbal cues. Just motion, synchronized and deliberate. She stepped outside to meet them as they returned. "You're not training him the way most people would," she said, her tone curious rather than critical. "I'm not asking him to be someone else," Caleb replied. She studied Briggs, noting the way his attention shifted between her and the tree line beyond, as if tracking more than one conversation at once. "He's adjusting to you," she said. "That doesn't happen by accident." "It doesn't happen by force either," Caleb answered. Sarah nodded slowly. Experience had taught her that control often masked insecurity. Trust required patience, and patience required humility. She had learned that lesson years earlier after losing a dog to a rushed rehabilitation timeline imposed by someone who never set foot in the field. Since then, she favored slow progress and quiet consistency, even when policy pushed otherwise. In town, people began to notice them, not because they drew attention, but because they moved with purpose. Maggie watched from the cafe window as Caleb and Briggs crossed the street one morning, snow clinging to their boots and fur. Briggs walked slightly ahead, scanning, then paused until Caleb caught up. Maggie smiled faintly. She recognized that look. It was the same look she had worn herself after her husband died, when survival meant learning to read the world differently. Not everyone understood it. A man named Tom Wilkes, a part-time hunting guide in his late 40s with a heavy build and a voice that carried easily, stopped Caleb one afternoon near the general store. Tom wore a thick flannel jacket and a permanent expression of skepticism earned from years outdoors. "That dog's old," he said, nodding toward Briggs. "Mountains aren't kind to old bones." Caleb met his gaze calmly. "They're not kind to careless ones either." Tom shrugged, unconvinced, and walked on. Briggs did not react, but his ears flicked briefly in the man's direction, cataloging the exchange without emotion. The training continued. No routines were fixed. Caleb varied routes, times, conditions. Sometimes they moved during a light snowfall, sometimes through wind that cut sideways through the trees. Briggs adapted, conserving energy, compensating where strength waned, with awareness sharpened by experience. Caleb adjusted too, learning to trust what was not spoken. Late one afternoon, clouds gathered low and heavy, darkening the peaks. A distant rumble echoed through the valley, not thunder, but something deeper, more ominous. Snow slid in small sheets along a nearby slope, settling without sound. Caleb and Briggs stopped simultaneously. Caleb felt it then, the same tension he had felt in other places, other terrains, when the ground itself seemed undecided. Briggs stood still, head lifted, nose testing the air, body angled toward the slope. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He waited. They turned back without discussion. That night, Caleb marked the map he kept on the cabin wall, noting unstable areas, altered routes. Briggs lay nearby, eyes half closed but alert, rising briefly when the wind shifted, then settling again. The mountains outside creaked and sighed under their burden, patient but strained. Training without commands had not made them reckless. It had made them attentive. And as winter deepened, the space between skill and survival grew narrower. The storm arrived without apology. Snow that had fallen lightly for days thickened into a relentless curtain, erasing the mountains in broad strokes and swallowing the narrow roads that wound through Silver Ridge. By mid-morning, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Wind drove the snow sideways, piling it against trees and rooftops, reshaping the land faster than anyone could adapt. Sirens wailed briefly in town before falling silent, swallowed by the weather. Caleb Morrison listened to the emergency broadcast from the small radio on his kitchen counter. The voice was strained, clipped, careful not to sound alarmed. A group of hikers had failed to return from a marked trail near the upper ridgeline before the storm intensified. Initial search teams had attempted access before being forced back by whiteout conditions and unstable snowpack. The word missing hung heavier than the rest. Briggs lifted his head from the floor the moment the broadcast began. His body tensed, not with excitement, but with attention. He rose slowly, joints stiff at first, then steadier as he stood, ears angling toward the door as if the storm itself were speaking to him. He moved to the window, nose close to the glass, breathing slow and deliberate. Caleb watched him, feeling the familiar pull of urgency tighten his chest. This was the sound he had spent years responding to. Not the words, but what lay beneath them, the hesitation, the uncertainty. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. Snow struck his face like grit, cold and biting. Across town, lights flickered as power lines strained. People moved quickly between buildings, heads down, shoulders hunched. The mountains loomed unseen, their presence felt rather than seen. At the volunteer fire station, activity buzzed despite the weather. Trucks idled, engines rumbling, their red lights cutting through the gray. Inside, maps were spread across tables, radios crackled, Voices overlapped. Hannah Brooks stood near the center of it all, her dark hair pulled into a tight braid beneath a knit cap, her posture upright and controlled. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, her build shaped by years as a park ranger and search coordinator. Her face bore the calm authority of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. A climbing accident years earlier had left her with a permanent limp and an unshakable respect for terrain that did not forgive mistakes. "We've got 3 confirmed missing," Hannah said, tapping the map with a gloved finger. They were experienced, but the weather turned faster than expected. Primary teams were pulled back after 2 hours. Snowpack's unstable. Secondary avalanche risk is high. Caleb stepped closer, eyes tracing the marked trail. "They're somewhere along this ridge." "That's our best guess," Hannah replied. "But right now, guessing gets people killed." Her gaze flicked briefly to Briggs, who stood just inside the doorway, snow clinging to his fur. "Dogs aren't cleared," she added, her tone firm but not dismissive. "Too dangerous in these conditions." Caleb nodded. He had expected that. Protocol existed for a reason. He stepped back, hands open, showing no resistance. Outside, the storm worsened. Hours passed with no update. Search teams waited for a break in the weather that did not come. Radios hissed with static. Tension thickened the air. Back at the cabin, Caleb paced. He tried to occupy his hands, his mind, anything to keep from listening to the storm hammer against the walls. Briggs remained near the door, alert, his attention fixed outward. At one point, he let out a low sound, not a bark, not a whine, just a brief vibration in his chest. Caleb stopped pacing. Briggs moved to the map Caleb had pinned to the wall, the one he had marked days earlier with unstable slopes and altered routes. The dog sniffed along the paper, then turned sharply, stepping toward the door, stopping, then looking back at Caleb. His body language was precise, insistent. "You smell something," Caleb murmured. Briggs returned to the map, nose hovering over a section near the ridge, then moved back to the door again, pawing once at the floor. Snow continued to howl outside, but Briggs' focus did not waver. Caleb felt the choice forming before he named it. He thought of Hannah's warning, of protocol, of the word "too old" written quietly between the lines of every official assessment Briggs had ever received. He thought of the way Briggs had stopped short days earlier when the slope shifted, of the judgment that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with survival. He knelt, meeting the dog's eyes. "You're sure?" Briggs held his gaze, steady and unblinking. Caleb stood, decision settling into him with the calm certainty he remembered from operations long past. He packed quickly, essentials only. When he opened the door, the storm rushed in, raw and unforgiving. Briggs stepped forward without hesitation. They moved out of town along a service road, half buried by snow. The wind pushed against them, forcing each step into intention. Visibility shrank to a few yards at best. Caleb relied on memory, on instinct, on the subtle guidance of the dog beside him. Briggs adjusted their path constantly, angling away from wind-loaded slopes, choosing terrain that offered the slightest margin of safety. As they climbed, the sound of the storm changed, deepened. Snow shifted underfoot, settling in soft, ominous sighs. Briggs slowed, then stopped, body tense, head lifted. He took a step back, redirecting Caleb with his shoulder, guiding him toward a line of trees. Caleb followed without question. Ahead, through the blur of white, the mountain waited, unstable and unforgiving. Somewhere beyond it, 3 people fought the cold and the dark, their chances narrowing with every passing minute. Behind them lay rules, reason, and permission. Ahead lay risk. Caleb tightened his grip on the strap of his pack and stepped forward as Briggs moved into the white, leading them into the storm. The storm thickened as they climbed, the kind of white that erased distance and sound until the world narrowed to breath and movement. Snow packed against Caleb Morrison's jacket, crept into the seams of his gloves, burned his face raw. Each step demanded attention. Each pause carried weight. Briggs moved ahead of him, not fast, not slow, choosing the line that held, the ground that did not whisper collapse. His tail stayed low, his ears tuned forward, his body angled with an economy born of years spent reading danger before it announced itself. They reached a stretch of open slope, where the trees thinned and the wind pressed harder, pushing snow into shallow drifts that hid the ground beneath. Caleb felt the mountain shift before he saw it. A subtle tremor carried through his boots. He adjusted his stance, preparing to move, but Briggs stopped short so abruptly that Caleb nearly collided with him. The old German shepherd planted his feet and turned sideways, blocking the path with his body, his head snapping upslope. A dull crack split the air, not loud enough to roar, but sharp enough to mean death. Snow broke loose above them in a cascading sheet, sliding fast and heavy. Caleb dropped instinctively, digging his boots into the slope, heart hammering as White rushed past where they would have been moments earlier. The snow settled in choking silence, burying the trail behind them. Caleb lay still, breath ragged, the cold seeping into his bones. He lifted his head slowly. Briggs stood exactly where he had stopped, legs braced, eyes fixed upslope, until the mountain finished speaking. Only then did he turn back to Caleb. If Briggs hadn't stopped them, there would have been no second chance. No call for help, just silence under snow. Caleb pushed himself upright, shaking, not from cold, but from the sudden understanding of how narrow the margin had been. He reached out without thinking, gripping the thick fur at Briggs's neck. The dog did not flinch. "Good call," Caleb said hoarsely. Briggs did not respond. He had already moved on. They angled away from the slope, descending carefully into a shallow ravine where the wind softened and the snow thinned. Briggs slowed, nose working, movements precise. He stopped again, not abruptly this time, but with purpose, head lowered, tail still. Caleb followed his gaze downward. The ravine narrowed into a rocky cleft, its walls steep and uneven. Below, wedged between ice and stone, lay the hikers. There were 3 of them, shapes barely distinguishable beneath layers of snow and frozen gear. 2 stirred faintly, breaths shallow and uneven. The 3rd did not move at all. The cold had already begun to claim what it could. Caleb dropped to one knee at the edge, assessing quickly. The slope into the cleft was steep and unstable, snow layered over rock in a way that would not support his weight. One wrong move, and the entire pocket could collapse, burying them all. He checked his radio, knowing what the answer would be before it came. Static. Distance. Time they did not have. Briggs did not wait for instruction. He stepped forward, testing the descent with one paw, then another, claws scraping lightly against ice. His body trembled, not with fear, but with effort. He moved sideways, careful to distribute his weight, easing himself down until he reached the closest hiker, a young man with frost-bitten hands and a face drained of color. Briggs positioned himself deliberately, pressing his body against the man's chest, angling his shoulder to shield the exposed face from the wind that funneled through the cleft. Snow gathered on Briggs's back, melting briefly against his warmth before freezing again. His breath came slower now, heavier. Caleb watched, helpless and stunned. Every instinct told him to go down there, to do something, to take the weight himself. But the ground beneath his boots shifted with even the smallest adjustment. He stayed where he was, the decision cutting deep. Minutes passed, then more. The wind screamed overhead, driving snow into the ravine, burying Briggs' legs deeper. The dog did not move. He adjusted only once, lifting his head long enough to reposition the hiker's face above the snow line, then settled again, muscles quivering with strain. Caleb shouted his name once, the sound torn apart by the storm. Briggs did not look up. He was not ignoring Caleb. He was choosing. The second hiker coughed weakly, a thin sound that barely carried. Caleb shifted closer to the edge, bracing himself against a rock outcropping, calling encouragement down into the cleft. He could see Briggs's sides heaving now, each breath a visible effort. The years that had dulled his joints pressed hard against him, the cold gnawing at bones that had already given so much. Caleb felt the old familiar helplessness claw at his chest, the same feeling he had carried out of places where rescue arrived too late or not at all. He fought it down, forcing himself to stay present. To wait. At last, through the storm, he heard it. Voices, the low rumble of engines straining uphill. Rescue had broken through. Lights cut briefly through the white, and figures emerged, moving carefully, methodically. Hannah Brooks appeared at the edge of the ravine, her face drawn tight beneath her helmet, eyes sharp as she took in the scene. She gave clipped instructions, her voice steady despite the conditions. When the first rescuer reached Briggs, he paused, surprised. "The dog's holding him," he said. Hannah nodded once. "Then don't rush him." They worked quickly but carefully, stabilizing the hikers one by one. Briggs did not move until the weight of the first man was lifted away. When it was, his legs buckled. He collapsed onto his side, chest heaving, eyes half closed. Caleb slid down as far as the terrain allowed, reaching for him. "Briggs," he said, his voice breaking through the wind. The dog's eyes opened at the sound, just enough. His gaze found Caleb's face, steady even now. Not relief, not pride. Completion. Medics worked around them, hands efficient, movements precise. One checked Briggs briefly, shaking his head. "He shouldn't have been able to hold that long." Caleb knelt there in the snow, one hand buried in Briggs' fur, feeling the slow, stubborn beat of his heart beneath his palm. The mountain loomed above them, quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Briggs had not acted because he was commanded to. He had acted because he decided it mattered. And in that choice, the label placed on him by age and policy fell away, replaced by something far heavier and far more true. The storm loosened its grip reluctantly, leaving Silver Ridge wrapped in a quiet that felt earned rather than given. Snowbanks stood higher along the roads, reshaped by plows and patience. The mountains emerged again, scarred where slides had cut pale seams through dark timber. In the days that followed, the town moved carefully, as if aware that survival had been negotiated rather than guaranteed. The hikers lived, all three of them. The news traveled first as relief, then as detail, then as story. At the clinic, nurses spoke in low voices about frostbitten fingers and lungs that would take time to heal. A physician named Daniel Harper, a compact man in his late 30s with tired eyes and a steady demeanor, explained to anyone who asked that minutes had mattered more than medicine. He had worked emergency rooms in cities before choosing a rural practice, and the calm urgency he carried now was the residue of nights that never truly ended. He did not exaggerate. He did not need to. Caleb Morrison kept his distance from the attention. He checked on Briggs, sat with him during long hours of rest, and listened as the dog's breathing steadied and his strength returned in small, stubborn increments. Briggs bore the after-effects quietly. He slept more, rose slower, favored one hind leg in the cold. His eyes, however, remained clear. When he walked, it was with the same deliberate care, as if the mountain still spoke to him, even indoors. Sarah Whitaker visited once the roads reopened. She stood in the cabin doorway with snow melting on her boots, taking in the scene without comment. She was dressed simply, fleece jacket zipped to her chin, hair pulled back as usual, but there was a softness to her expression that had not been there before. She had seen many dogs work. She had seen fewer choose. "You did right by him," she said quietly after a moment. Caleb nodded. "He did right by all of us." In town, the story found its shape. Maggie set down coffee mugs to tell it, her voice steady, eyes shining. Tom Wilkes, the hunting guide who had once dismissed Briggs as too old, stood near the general store and corrected anyone who repeated that opinion. He did not apologize. He simply adjusted. That was how Silver Ridge worked. Pride bent when evidence demanded it. The call came from the volunteer fire station a week later. Hannah Brooks asked Caleb to stop by. When he arrived, the station hummed with activity that felt different from emergency. Maps were pinned neatly, chairs arranged in a loose circle. The mood was thoughtful rather than frantic. Hannah stood at the front, weight balanced on her good leg, her braid tucked into a jacket collar. She looked older than she had during the storm, not from exhaustion, but from responsibility. "We got lucky," she said, meeting the room's eyes. "Luck is not a plan." She turned to Caleb. "We don't have the budget for full-time professionals," she continued, "but we have people, willing ones. We need training that respects the terrain and the reality of who we are." Caleb hesitated. He had spent years being defined by what he was. He was not interested in returning to that. "I'm not here as a SEAL," he said finally. Hannah nodded. "Good. I'm not asking for one." The first session was small. A handful of volunteers gathered in the cleared lot behind the station. There was a retired teacher named Elaine Porter, short and brisk, her gray hair cut neatly, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. She had taken up hiking after losing her husband and refused to give it up to fear. There was Marcus Reed, a broad-shouldered mechanic in his early 30s, quiet and methodical, who understood machines and people in equal measure. There was a teenager named Noah Pike, lanky and eager, whose confidence ran ahead of his experience. Caleb took them in with a single glance and adjusted. He did not raise his voice. He did not line them up. He spoke about reading snow, about listening to silence, about when to stop moving. He spoke about humility as a skill. Briggs lay nearby at first, resting, then rose when the group moved. He positioned himself where he could see everyone, his presence calm and grounding. "Watch him," Caleb said simply. They did. Briggs demonstrated without performing. He chose safer ground. He paused at edges. He waited when waiting mattered. When Noah rushed ahead once, Briggs stepped into his path and stopped. The message landed without embarrassment. Words spread quickly. Not with drama, but with interest. More volunteers came. The training evolved, not into a program with a name, but into a practice shaped by the mountains themselves. Briggs became part of it without being made into a mascot. He did not wear patches. He did not pose. He worked when needed and rested when he did not. Children in town began to greet him by name. One left a knitted scarf on the fence outside the station, red and crooked. Briggs ignored it until Caleb tied it loosely around his neck for warmth, then tolerated it with dignity. Laughter followed, then quiet respect. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Useful no longer meant young. It no longer meant fast. It meant present. It meant willing. It meant choosing to stay when leaving was easier. Caleb felt the change inside himself as well. He slept better. He woke with purpose that did not demand adrenaline to justify itself. When he spoke to the volunteers, he listened more than he instructed. The habits of command loosened, replaced by collaboration. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the cold settled in, Caleb stood with Hannah outside the station. Briggs lay nearby, eyes half closed, listening. "You're building something," Hannah said. "No," Caleb replied. "We are." She smiled, satisfied. The mountains remained indifferent, as they always would. But the town had learned something it would not forget. Value did not expire. It adapted. And in that adaptation, a dog once labeled too old became the measure by which usefulness was understood. Spring did not arrive all at once in Silver Ridge. It came cautiously, in brief thaws and longer shadows, in streams that loosened their grip on ice, but refused to rush. Snow still lingered in the high places, but mornings softened, and the light found its way through branches that had carried winter for too long. The mountains remained what they were, patient and indifferent, but the town breathed easier. Briggs never returned to the military. No papers were filed, no uniform refitted, no ceremony arranged. He did not need any of that. His days settled into a rhythm that matched the land. He slept when the cabin warmed, rose when the air changed, and stood at the door each morning as if greeting an old responsibility he had chosen to keep. At 10 years old, his body asked for care now. His hind leg favored the cold. His pace shortened, but his attention never dulled. He listened to the world the way he always had, not for orders, but for meaning. Caleb Morrison did not return to the battlefield either. The thought crossed his mind once, briefly, when an old contact reached out with an offer that promised clarity and structure. He declined without hesitation. The clarity he needed no longer lived in command chains or distant objectives. It lived here in the slow understanding of days that mattered without being loud. Their mornings began before town stirred. Caleb brewed coffee and opened the door, letting the cold greet them honestly. Briggs stepped into the snow, nose lifted, breath steady. They walked the same path most days, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. They checked the river where ice broke earlier each year now. They watched the tree line for subtle changes. They paused where the ground softened and adjusted their route without discussion. It was not training, it was stewardship. People noticed, but no one interrupted. Silver Ridge had learned the value of quiet examples. Children waved from porches. Maggie raised a mug in greeting from the cafe window. Hannah passed them on patrol once, her limp more pronounced on uneven ground, and nodded without stopping. The town no longer needed to ask what they were doing. It understood. Briggs aged as all living things do, not dramatically, but persistently. His muzzle silvered further. His naps lengthened. Some days he chose the porch over the trail, watching the mountains rather than walking into them. Caleb respected those choices. Service had taught him when to push. Life was teaching him when not to. On a clear afternoon, Sarah Whitaker visited again. She stood outside the cabin, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, taking in the quiet with appreciation. Her life at the facility continued, steady and demanding, but she looked lighter now. The years of carrying losses alone had eased, replaced by the knowledge that not every ending meant disappearance. "He looks good," she said, crouching to greet Briggs, her touch gentle and familiar. "He is," Caleb replied. She smiled at that. "You changed things here," she added, gesturing vaguely toward town. "We did," Caleb said, correcting her without emphasis. Sarah accepted that easily. She had learned to recognize shared credit when she saw it. As summer approached, the volunteer program settled into itself. Caleb attended when needed, guided when asked, and stepped back when the group found its own rhythm. Briggs came sometimes, rested other times. No one questioned it. The symbol had done its work. The presence remained. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the peaks in gold, Caleb sat on the cabin steps with Briggs beside him. The dog leaned into his leg, not for support, but for contact. Caleb rested a hand on the familiar curve of his shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall beneath his palm. They had been told Briggs was too old. The words no longer carried weight. They had been proven small by days that mattered. Service had not ended. It had changed shape. Caleb watched the light fade and felt no urge to chase it. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing what he could with who he had chosen. The war no longer followed him into sleep. The mountains no longer felt like something to conquer. They felt like something to listen to. When night settled fully, Caleb stood and opened the door. Briggs followed, slow but certain. Inside, the cabin waited, warm and unassuming. Tomorrow would come as it always did, without ceremony, offering nothing but the chance to show up. And that was enough. Sometimes the world decides that something is finished simply because it looks slower than before, because it carries scars, because time has left visible marks. But God does not measure worth the way the world does. In this story, no trumpet sounded, no lightning split the sky. The miracle arrived quietly, through an old dog who chose to stay, through a man who chose to listen. That is how many of God's miracles come into our lives, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, faithful, persistent. Briggs was called too old, Caleb was called finished, yet God still had work for both of them. And maybe that is the message meant for us. If you feel overlooked, if you feel past your prime, if you feel like your best years are behind you, remember this: God never retires his servants. He only changes the way they serve. Your kindness may be the warmth that saves someone else. Your patience may be the shield against another person's storm. Your presence may be the miracle someone has been praying for. So walk into your days with quiet courage. Listen more than you speak. Stand firm when leaving would be easier. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may feel forgotten. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so these stories can reach others who need hope. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in every season of life. And if you believe that faith still works in quiet ways, type Amen in the comments.